Hey there, emerging expat. You're tuned in to Let's Move to Portugal. I'm Victoria from Expats Everywhere's podcast, and I have the distinct honor of bringing you, YouTube travelers, and our resident Portugal experts, Expats Everywhere's Josh and Kaylee. Each week they'll inspire, they'll educate, and they'll accompany you on your journey to Portuguese residency. This week on Let's Move to Portugal, Josh and Kyler, a fourth-generation Portuguese American, discuss the details of the D2 visa process, the journey from Spain to Portugal, and the challenges of obtaining Portuguese citizenship.
Hey, expats and travelers, welcome back to the Expats Everywhere Presents Let's Move to Portugal podcast. Kaylee, how you doing?
I'm doing well today. How are you doing?
I am doing fantastically well. The weather,
fantastically well.
Yeah, the weather has been hit or miss, but this past weekend it was pretty good, and that was nice to play around in.
Still a little chilly though. Kind of surprising. It seems like you look outside and the sun's shining, so it doesn't seem too cold, but then a little cold still for March.
Yeah, I mean, I find that like when I take Valencia to school in the morning, it's cooler, and then by the time I get back, if the sun is out, then it's like warm in the sun.
Yeah,
it's that in between period right now, which is normal. Listen, listener, if you are new here, we want to welcome you and we thank you for being here. And if you're not, then just ignore the next 10 seconds of what I'm going to say. So if you're not used to this format, what we do is we start out with an introduction from our producer, Victoria. Then we move into what we call the weekly welcome, where we get you caught up in the next 7 to 10 minutes on what's happening in the world of expats everywhere before we get into the interview of the day. And today we talk to a guy named Kyler.
Yes, very interesting. Something a little different, but he lives in Portugal, so he's got some ancestry here, but then also did the D2 route, which is not as common as the D7 or D8. So
yeah, we'll preview that in a minute. Kaylee, what have we been up to?
Oh, that is a good question. I feel like we've been very busy. I think partly because we'll head back to the U.S. in April for a trip. And so we're trying to get ahead of ourselves.
Yeah.
And so it's just been very busy with all the different videos we've been filming. And then, of course, doing podcasts. And I'm working on the next newsletter. And I don't know. We've been doing a lot, but I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I mean, the one thing that stuck out to me is we went to the FC Porto match this weekend and they finally won. Like they finally won at home in 2025. And I believe from a historical context standpoint, I believe it was like the longest winless run in club history.
Oh, was it?
I'm pretty sure.
Kind of in a,
I mean, we had some draws in there, but it was rough. So the atmosphere around the stadium was okay.
Right.
Not great.
It was nice that the game was earlier. It was at 6 rather than a lot of times it's like at 8. So it was actually still light because we haven't had our daylight saving time yet. That happens at the end of the month for us.
Yes.
So it was nice that it was earlier and still light when the game started.
And good point about that with the daylight savings thing. So if you're currently trying to book any sort of calls or whatever with people that are based here in Portugal, be sure and check your calendar and the time that you put in your calendar. Because right now we're 4 hours ahead of East Coast, and then do the math from there.
Just a couple more weeks, though.
It's usually throughout the year a 5-hour time difference, but right now it's 4.
Yes, we'll have ours at the end of the month, so it's coming up.
Yeah. Okay. So anything happening legal wise in Portugal?
Legal? No. We did film a video with a lawyer, Diogo, who we will talk a bit about. The big thing for that one will be renewals. Oh gosh, renewals. Trying to renew your residency is rough right now.
Yeah.
Actually, I'm also hearing that it's hard to get that initial visa appointment at either the consulate or VFS, depending on who you go through. They are just not unlocking as many as they used to. I think they're trying to slow things down, honestly, because they are so overwhelmed that they're just trying to slow the initial applications, and which they seem to be actually prioritizing as opposed to the renewals, which I talked to Diogo about that in the video to come out in a couple weeks. But I just think that it's just still really backed up and they're slowing things down for people.
Yeah.
It's unfortunate.
And we did get a point of clarification because we had Diogo on the podcast and he said something to the effect of IMA's getting 5,000 calls or requests or something per applications. There we go. Per day. So we tried to like doing the math on that. That's like over 1.8 million applications in a year if that pace kept up, which would be, I mean, not quite double the current foreign population here in Portugal, but I mean, close. it'd be like, yeah, just about double, to be honest, because I think we're right now at like 1.1 million.
So we talk a little bit about that and what the president of IMA came out and said that. So he mentions that, and then what that actually looks like, 5,000 of what type of applications. And of course, they're not all approved. But anyway, it just takes time to process that. And they are just low staffed. And so
I mean, you act like it's a burden for yourself, but it's not.
It's not, but I get that it's disheartening when you're trying to apply or trying to renew. And the biggest thing is, generally, the
renewals are the real problem.
Yeah, you're
because
stuck.
People are stuck.
Yeah, you can't leave Portugal, so you're not necessarily here illegally because of stuff that they've done in the government that's has this overarching like visa extension. But you are stuck if you want to leave Portugal. So,
would you say that you can't leave Portugal, or would you say that you can't go anywhere else in Europe?
It's risky to do either, actually.
Okay.
Now, they do give you have paperwork saying that you're in the process, but it kind of is dependent on whether the country you're in bothers to look at that.
No,
it's harder to leave. Okay, I know what you're saying.
Let's say like going back to your home country, like if you want to go back to your passport country, when your residence card has expired, isn't that less risky than traveling in other parts of Europe or going back to your home country and then flying back into Europe, but not back directly into Portugal?
Okay, so all of it's risky. And it's one thing is what people I think don't think about is the airline person, I don't know what you call that, worker that checks your stuff. They're supposed to be looking for your visa status as well. And they don't know. Like, you can show them papers from IMA that you've gotten the renewal and you're waiting for the card in the mail or whatever. But they are actually worse, I think, than immigration officers, because immigration officers know. Yeah, they could not let you board. I've known several people who have had to like have long conversations with just the airline worker about how they are legally allowed to be like to return to Portugal. So that's the thing is, obviously, if you leave the Schengen, you will have your papers checked, even though you have paperwork that says you're in the process. It just depends on how they want to look at that. And yeah, I mean, I would push back, of course. But then obviously if you're flying like in the Schengen, if you're flying from Portugal to, let's say, Germany, you don't go through any sort of immigration.
Yeah.
They won't check. And the airline worker doesn't check that either, because you don't have to look at your papers. So that's probably a little less risky. But overall, the safest thing you can do is just stay in Portugal. Learn a little more about Portugal, explore smaller cities and towns.
Would you, on a personal level, do that if you're like in this limbo period for a year or more?
See, if it's a year, I think at some point I'd be like, let's risk it. I think I would wait a little bit, a few months before, just kind of plan, okay, we probably aren't going to get it for a few months, because we actually might be in this situation at the turn of next year, because we will be applying for citizenship later this year.
Yeah.
But we also have to get our permanent residency then.
Yeah.
So who knows how long that's going to take. So I guess in my mind now, I think let's give them a few months. So already pre-planning what travel looks like, maybe in Portugal or driving into Spain or something.
Yeah.
But then I don't know. After a year of it, I feel like, let's just risk it.
Yeah. And if you're kind of unfamiliar with the whole citizenship thing, if you're further along in your journey, and we've talked about this actually on other podcast episodes, I believe. I don't think we've had a video about this. But basically you have to do two things at the same time if you're going to apply for citizenship and you want to continue to live in Portugal. You apply for citizenship, but then you also apply to extend your residence permit. So both of those things need to be done. They
go to different organizations too.
Yeah.
So you have to do both of those. And actually, since we can apply for citizenship later this year, we will be documenting all of that so that you all can see and listen to at least the process of what that's like.
Yeah. And before we talk about Kyler and his Portuguese citizenship, because he has gone through, some of the challenges of obtaining Portuguese citizenship, I just want to kind of round out this little bit kind of about what's happened in the world of expats everywhere. We have put out several pieces recently, maybe not directly related to Portugal, but kind of adjacent. And that content's flying right now. So thank you so much for tuning into that stuff on the YouTube channel. That's awesome. We're inching closer to relaunching Let's Get Building with Josh and Kaylee, the real estate journey that we've been on here in Portugal. We're basically just about past the last barrier to get the channel back up, and then we'll get new episodes coming out.
Right.
But Kyler.
Yes. So he applied for ancestry, right? Because he has family with Portuguese ancestry, obviously. But something to be aware of, if you do find that, it could take a long time to actually get that process. Like sometimes it takes years for it to fully go through and get that passport. So
yeah. Well, I mean, I think this is the interesting thing about this conversation is that he looked at kind of his options moving from Spain to Portugal because he spent significant time in Spain as well. And he decided because of his, let's say, the job that he was doing, that the D2 made a lot of sense for him. So he's a remote worker and he can do his job, anywhere. He decided, hey, let me move to Portugal. Let me do it on the D2, which that visa's for
Entrepreneurship.
Yeah. So he started a company.
Mm-hmm.
And then, while here, he went through the process of getting Portuguese citizenship by way of heritage because his family is from Portugal.
Mm-hmm. But that'll be interesting because it's a little bit of a comparison of like, since he has lived in Spain and now, he is Portuguese and then living in Portugal, you guys talk a little bit about the differences there.
Yeah, absolutely. So we talk kind of the differences in several ways. One, Spain and Portugal. The other one is kind of the connection between his Portuguese American experience back in the U.S., like from the Boston area. And then, how that manifests itself into living here in Portugal. What are the similarities and differences? Because he's fourth generation Portuguese American. So he's not super removed. And there's some cultural things that in that community in the U.S., they still hold like really close.
Mm-hmm.
So then when he moves here, he still feels like very normal.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel so foreign.
It's interesting.
But he's able to highlight and articulate that stuff probably better than anybody else has. But I think because he knows it so intimately.
Right.
So it was a great episode for me to be a part of. And honestly, like when we got down to like the last, 5 minutes of the 45, I was like, dude, we could keep going.
Mm-hmm.
So, if you do enjoy this episode and you want to hear more, then let us know and maybe we can bring him back on.
Yeah, sounds good.
All right,
let's
get to the episode.
All right, but before we do that, let's talk about this week's sponsor, Green Ocean Global Advisors.
Yes, we always recommend, no matter where you are in the moving process, to get your finances in order. So that's in your home country and then the country that you're moving to.
And speaking about homes, what if you sell your house before leaving or do it after? What are the capital gains implications like? Well, a financial advisor will be able to walk you through this type of thing.
And what about distributions? Maybe you have a 401k or a pension and you need to figure out how much you should be drawing from for the lifestyle that you're going to have.
Now, you can use this link in the description section below to talk to John from Green Ocean Global Advisors to see if he's a fit for you. You'll have a free 15-minute consultation just for being an Expats Everywhere listener. So you can use that to get your free 15 minutes. Click the link in the description section below. Now, on to the show.
Kyler, thank you so much for joining us. I feel like this episode might be a little schizophrenic and we're going to be a little all over the place, but it's honestly because you're going to bring so much value to this podcast in a variety of areas as we talk about the D2 visa, which is a visa we don't often cover because we don't know that many people that do it. We're going to talk about Portuguese citizenship, comparing Spain and Portugal as you have experience like we do in both. You ready to dive in, my man?
I'm totally ready to dive in. And I want to thank you for having me today. I've been listening to the podcast for a while and I kind of pitched myself to join, but I figured, like as you said, my life's a bit all over the place. So I guess schizophrenic's a good way to describe it. But I felt like I had a lot of knowledge to share and I wanted to kind of get myself out there to help the viewers because even though I'm kind of set into my process here and very settled in Portugal, I still listen to the show and I find it very interesting to hear different perspectives. So I wanted to share mine.
Awesome. No, we're so thankful that you reached out and we look forward to seeing what this next 45 minutes does for everybody. Okay, so we need to start kind of at the beginning. It may be in the middle for your story, but at the beginning, at least for the listener, you were living in Spain and had this desire to move to Portugal. Why?
Okay, that's a really great question. So to start at the very, very beginning, I'm fourth generation Portuguese American. And I think a lot of people, when I say that, are like, yeah, that's fourth generation. But I grew up in a city called New Bedford, Massachusetts, and it has, I think between them and the neighboring city of Fall River, we have the highest Portuguese population in the United States. So, I mean, my grandparents spoke Portuguese. Every thing in my life was revolved around the food, the culture. I had processions and festas in where I live, and every summer we do that. So I always felt very connected to my roots. And especially the Azorean roots. My family all came from the Azores on both my mom and my father's side. So I think that always was part of me, and I always felt kind of like I had a dual identity, even though the language skills my grandparents didn't teach my parents, and I've learned now on my own as an adult. But I've always felt connected with Portugal, and I always had a curiosity for it. But as everyone listening in the U.S. would know, like Portuguese is not really a common language to be offered in schools. So as a language requirement, I kind of leaned more towards Spanish, which led me to then go to university. Wasn't planning on studying Spanish, but fell in love with it there and majored in Spanish and history. And then my third year, I studied abroad for a full year in northern Spain. And that's when I fell in love with Spain. And I was like, I am coming back. I just felt so at home in Europe that I was just like, I need to come back. So I moved to Spain when I graduated my undergrad in 2014, and I taught Spanish and English in Spain for 2 years, and I got my master's and then started working there. So that's kind of how I ended up in Spain. I think I always knew I wanted to maybe live in Europe at some point, but then kind of fell in love with Spain and I don't know, that kind of captivated me for a while. And then it was actually the pandemic in 2020. I think it was just being locked in my apartment for so long in Madrid that I had a lot of time to think. But also my grandmother died that year, and it sounds a bit morbid, but at the same time, it made me reflect a lot about my roots and my family. And I was just like, am I actually happy in Madrid? And I wasn't. I think I kind of had everything I wanted. I had the visa, I had the contract for a job, and I did all these goals, but I wasn't satisfied. So I started thinking more about how can I be satisfied? I didn't want to move back to the US, but I figured what would be the next step? And then kind of Lisbon came up for me, and I was just like, why not? And honestly, I went with, I'm sorry if there's people moving furniture upstairs. It's just this time of day. But basically, I thought, okay, like it makes sense maybe to try that. And I had this kind of feeling, and I just went with it. I didn't really know people here in Lisbon. I had a whole life and network in Madrid. And I said, okay, well, I'm just going to go and kind of take the dive and move to Lisbon and see what happens. And I did that and bought an apartment at the same time. So it was kind of crazy without knowing anyone here, but it just felt like I have to do this. And I wanted to be closer to my roots and closer to the ocean. I think that's a big part of my identity is the ocean. My family works in the fishing industry. I grew up 20 minutes from the beach my entire life until I moved to Spain. So I was kind of like, why am I not closer to that and to have better seafood? So that's kind of how I ended up here in Portugal. And that was about 3 years ago.
Do you find yourself to be like a lover of big cities or capital cities, moving from Madrid then to Lisbon?
Well, it's funny. People are like, Lisbon's such a big city. And I'm like, you never lived in Madrid because Madrid is like, that was one thing that I did get frustrated with Madrid was that to even go outside and have access to nature, it took like almost an hour to do that. While here, I can take the metro from my house to the beach and I'm there, at least can see the ocean in 10 minutes from my house. But I did really like living in a capital city. So I liked Madrid and being well connected. I like to travel a lot, like a lot of opportunities. So I kind of felt like if I was going to move, that was one thing too, when I was discerning between should I move to Portugal or not? It's like, well, I have a visa in Spain. I wasn't a Portuguese citizen at the time. So I figured maybe I should move somewhere else in Spain, but there was nowhere else that I really liked. So I guess I have a little affinity towards capital cities, but I fell in love with Lisbon, I have to say. So I'm very happy here as well.
Okay. So you didn't feel like anywhere else in Spain was like cosmopolitan or had that energy that you were seeking?
So there's Barcelona was on the list for a while, which I think is very popular now, more so than when I was looking in 2020. But I love learning languages, and I have no issue with learning Catalan, but I was like, if I'm going to learn another language, I wanted to be Portuguese. And that was kind of a big push for me, because I think a lot of the times, the reason why I don't speak Portuguese growing up is because of people my grandparents being discriminated against in the United States. And I felt very empowered to be like, moving here is kind of full circle because I'm coming back and I'm learning their language to kind of give them that dignity. And I really wanted to do that. So I was like, if I'm going to learn another language, it has to be Portuguese. And I had been studying Portuguese before just for fun in Madrid. So it kind of felt like it was a logical step. If I'm going to go somewhere and learn a new language, it might as well be Portugal.
Nice, man. Yeah, because if you're going to rule out Barcelona for that reason, then you might as well have to rule out Bilbao or Valencia for the same reasons.
Exactly.
You've got Basque and then remind me of what Valencia is. I know it's Valenciano, but
it's technically Catalan.
It's Catalan, yeah.
It's Catalan.
Not Castilian, Catalan, yeah.
And people might get mad at me for that, but I do have a master's in linguistics, and that's what we decided on, was that basically Valencian, it's kind of like a Spanish-sized version of Catalan. So they have a lot more influence from Castilian Spanish, but it is Catalan.
But the root is Catalan.
They can converse and understand each other fine. It's just they sound kind of like a Spaniard trying to speak Catalan sometimes because the accent's very Spanish. but
That
it's
is
totally
exactly what I remembered learning well over 10 years ago when I studied a master's in Spain as well. Okay, because we did talk about that in one of our linguistics courses. All right, so shifting from that, you moved to Lisbon, but you moved with a D2 visa.
I did.
So
Yes.
why? What's this D2 visa? Why did you choose that? Because it doesn't seem like a common path, one, but also it's definitely not the path of least resistance. So
Yeah.
what was that experience like?
Hopefully I don't get in trouble saying this, but I'm a citizen now, so they can't kick me out. But well, basically, I had been working with a law office here in Lisbon on my family's nationality process, so I already had that connection there. And I reached out to them to be like, "Hi, by the way, I want to move to Portugal. How can this happen?" And it actually was a previous guest of yours, Diogo Capella. He was my lawyer in this process. And at the time, I was working, and I still am working, finishing up at a multilingual content marketing agency, which does translation services. And he was kind of like, well, if you're going to be an independent contractor anyways in Portugal, which was the plan because my company didn't have an entity here to hire me directly, just apply as a translator and as a translation business. So I did the D2 process, kind of being like, I'm going to be a translator, and this is a skill that was needed, and it fit those qualifications. And he thought it was a more strategic, I guess, to have the D2 because it wasn't the D7. And that was during the time where D7 was kind of still grandfathered in maybe to be passive income or like freelance income.
It was all changing around that time.
Yeah. So he was kind of like, just go for the D2 because it's actually, you're going to get the full working rights that you would have. The only thing you can't do really is vote in this country. So if we can get you approved for that, we did that. And I have to say, my process is very different from the rest of the listeners, most likely, because I applied in Madrid. So I was a resident in Madrid. So my residency, my consular embassy was in Madrid. And it took me 2 weeks to get the visa approved. It was so fast.
Would you say that that's a product of lack of volume? That like they don't have that many people that are trying to move to Portugal, get a visa in Portugal?
Exactly. If you think about it, most people going to that embassy are either Portuguese, people living in Spain, or Spaniards or Europeans. So I don't think they actually had a lot of experience with my visa. And I think it was kind of a weird situation because they would call me and be like, you need this document, like things that you wouldn't happen in like the Washington embassy, for example. So I kind of knew like Pedro, the guy that worked there, became my friend, and he got it done in 2 weeks. So it was very, very quick and efficient. But I did have the help of a lawyer too that helped prepare everything. So I didn't do it myself.
So you know what's really interesting about this is that the other person that we've spoken to that has done the D2 was also had a second nationality. They were living out of their home country, living in another place, and had residency there, and applied then to move to Portugal. So this is someone who was from Singapore, living in Sydney, and applied for a D2 in Sydney, and also had like basically a 2-week wait. So this is the hack, right? Move, get residency somewhere else, then apply for the D2, and you can move faster to Portugal. I'm totally kidding for the listener. Don't do that. But if you do find yourself as an American living abroad somewhere not in Portugal and trying to get to Portugal, it's probably your fastest route. And maybe I think technically the way you should go, you won't be applying here in Portugal. You'll be applying wherever your country of residency is versus necessarily your home country or passport country. True?
Right. It's very true. Yes.
Okay. So what were some of the documents that they were asked for the D2, if you remember?
If I remember correctly, I mean, obviously the normal ones, your identification, a copy. I think my passport, I had to surrender that to them. I think the big thing was my job contract. They wanted to see that I had a contract. So my work gave me like a service agreement, basically saying they'd pay me X amount. I forget exactly the minimum of what they want. I think it was like tied to minimum wage here maybe, but you had to prove a certain amount of that you're going to have an income. And I think I think that was pretty much it in terms of like the paperwork. That wasn't too difficult. The thing that was kind of weird was I was going to move here and I was going to drive from Madrid 6 hours to Lisbon. So I was going to, two of my friends were going to offer to drive me there. And at the consulate, they were like, you need proof of entry of the country. So either like you need to have a notary sign a letter saying that your friend with, this passport number, blah, 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 on this day is going to be driving you there and see if that works, or just buy a flight and not go on it. That's what they told me. So I'm not saying anything. They're like, just buy the flight and go. it ended up working out well because my friends were really generous and they were like, we'll drive all your stuff there and you fly. And I was staying, at the time I was in the process of buying an apartment. So I was staying in like a 2-month rental. So I got there first, got the rental ready, and then they came. So, but I did end up buying a flight. That was kind of the weird loophole I had, was like, well, I found this 20 € flight. I'll just buy it. And that was proof of entry into the country. And in Europe, like we're in the Schengen zone, so there is no stamps at the border.
You're not
so
getting
I had
stamped.
to somehow prove, that I was going to enter that way.
Yeah, I didn't know if they were like they were going to ask you to fly to London and then London down to.
Thank God they didn't do that.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, super interesting. So hack number 1 is you entered in on the D7, the D2, and then also your second hack is that you shortened the amount of time to get Portuguese citizenship, but in a way that most people don't have the ability to. Tell us about your Portuguese citizenship process that you went through.
It's an interesting process. It wasn't straightforward, and nothing in Portugal is straightforward. I will tell you all that listening now. But basically, before 2015, my father was basically the most direct line from a Portuguese citizen to me was through my father. His grandparents were both from San Miguel in the Azores. And until 2015, the nationality law said that grandchildren could naturalize. They have to do the language tests, but they can naturalize without living in Portugal. So for me, at the time I was living in Spain, I would love to be European, obviously, but I can't because my father wouldn't be able to pass it on to me, because if he naturalizes, I was already over 18. I wasn't a minor anymore. So my career was done, basically. And then in 2015, the parliament here announced a law saying they want to make grandchildren of Portuguese citizens citizens of origin, as if they were born here. So it's like through the bloodline, not through naturalization. So naturalization, like this, if you're living here for 5 years and you get your citizenship, like you and Kaylee are doing, that's naturalization. Well, this is like direct bloodline. So they changed the rules, keeping the A2 requirement, and then making it quite streamlined. However, at the same time, when that happened, it took 2 years for them to approve that law. So it was 2015 and then 2017, they approved it. And in my mind, and this is kind of why I went to lawyers in the end, because I thought, okay, well, in my city of New Bedford, Massachusetts, we have our own consulate. There's one in Boston, but there's also one in New Bedford because there's so many Portuguese people. So I was like, well, my family is very involved in the community. We knew the person, like people working there. I was like, maybe they'll help us, like guide us. They did it all wrong. So they applied. We waited 2 years for it to be rejected. And that's how I reached out to La Maris Capella and Sociedade, who are here in Lisbon. And they were just starting off then too. I think probably one of the first clients. But I was like, hey, this happened. They tried to contest it and we had to apply all over again. Plus, I think the majority of the applicants were from Brazil. So a lot of people in Brazil obviously have ties to Portugal. So they got really started to get backlogged, because as we know, they're extremely backlogged now, even worse than they were back then. But we have applied again in 2020. The good thing with a lawyer, though, is that basically we were trying to figure out how to do the language tests, but it was the pandemic. So how is that going to happen? And the lawyer said, submit the process. It's going to take 2 years. We can add the language test results to the process. So we kind of took a risk, hoping that my dad would pass this exam. But basically we did that, and the lawyer was able to add it later on. So we applied in 2020, and then my dad had to prepare an exam to do the CIPLE exam in Boston. And fortunately, like I said before, being from a big Portuguese community, we have a Portuguese language school that offers one-on-one lessons for this. So basically, I actually did it with my dad, because my dad had very elementary level Portuguese, like great pronunciation, but at the same time, like didn't have that contact as a child. So we really kind of went to one-on-one tutoring for like almost a year. We went hard with that. And then he passed the exam in 2021, and then became a citizen in 2022. So it took a while. But then, according to Portuguese law, when my father became recognized as a Portuguese citizen of origin, I retroactively became the child of a Portuguese citizen. And therefore, it was my direct right to recognize my birth. So I knew that once my father became Portuguese, which would have been like, he could have failed the exam and not got the nationality. But once he got the nationality, they could never deny it for me. I didn't have to show a background check or anything, because it's my direct right through the blood. So we applied in 2022. At the end of 2024, like October, I became a Portuguese citizen. So finally, which was like a really rewarding, and I think for many reasons, right? I mean, obviously it makes my life here a lot easier, but for me, it was very important. It's just been part of my identity. And I think like I'm so proud to be Portuguese American, to have that recognized and know that this is my country as well. It was very, very gratifying, I would say.
Ooh, so many things, so many ways to go. Okay, so first of all, just to give the listener an indication of what it's like going through the citizenship process, you say, let's say it took 2 years for you to get recognized as a citizen. You weren't having to do things on a daily or weekly basis, paperwork wise. It was basically put the application in and then wait.
Forever in a day.
Which can be a daily task,
Yes.
waiting and being patient. But as long as people know that there's this waiting period, then you must wait. Then at least we're being upfront in that way. Okay, we have to share with the audience your last name, Canastra.
Canastra. Yeah.
So, do you pronounce it in the U.S.? Did you pronounce it the Portuguese way, or was it Canastra? Canastra. Canastra.
I have a Boston accent sometimes it comes out, but Canastra would be how it's pronounced. And it's interesting. It's a very unique name. So I think it was fun to move here, and people were like, "That's a Portuguese word, but it's not a common last name." And there are other people with my last name in the country. I've looked, and I know they exist. But basically, my last name means basket in Portuguese, and there's a specific type of basket that's kind of long. And women would traditionally put it over their heads to carry fish back in the day. And you'll hear it a lot, actually, in Fado songs, a lot of references to canastras. But I wouldn't say it's the most common word for basket, if that makes sense. It's a very niche basket. And we were told that like our family were basket makers and fish basket makers. And I always thought that was kind of weird, but ironic because my father was a fisherman and then now owns one of the biggest seafood auctions in North America with my uncle and my sister running it. And I just thought like, oh, that's ironic. But then I realized, no, I did some more research. And in the Azores, since they're very small islands, and a lot of people, there's a lot of mixing and matching. Like my parents are apparently third cousins, but like distant cousins. But it was very normal just because you think about it, islands in the middle of nowhere. And then people just got sent there and then they stayed there. So a lot of people had the same last name. That's what I'm trying to get at. People had the same last name. So they would then take maybe their trade or like a characteristic of the family and pin it on to their last name. So my great grandfather was Manuel Cabral, which is a very normal Portuguese name, Canastra. And I think when he went to the US, they thought Cabral was his middle name, which in Portugal, we don't really have middle names. So we lost Cabral and Canastra stayed. And actually on my dad's side of the family, Alferes, as we say in an American accent, is Alferes, which is like a military position. And apparently my great-great-grandfather on the smallest island in the Azores, which has like 400 people, and they're all related to me. It's odd, but lovely place, Corvu it's called. And apparently he was that position in the military and just changed his last name to Alferes. So it became that. So it was very common, I guess, in the Azores to kind of just like throw a new last name on to distinguish yourself from maybe your relative.
Fascinating. I think that's sort of common in Europe, at least, where whatever your occupation is, you kind of take that on as your last name. But that's really that's really interesting from a Portuguese perspective that you've got this rather unique last name. I haven't heard it. I haven't met a Canastra, but it's cool to hear and hear the backstory behind it being Azorean. Tell us more about that, like being raised in a Portuguese community in the US and how now living in Portugal, you're kind of finding little connections.
It's been rewarding, I would say is the word to describe it, because I definitely think there's one thing to distinguish, which I think the Portuguese American experience is very unique because it's obviously things there are going to be like Americanized in many ways, but also the Azorean American experience in the Azores are very different than the continent here. There's a lot of foods and stuff that I can get easily back home or in the Azores, but not here. So there definitely was like that shock, like me expecting certain things to be available and they weren't. But honestly, I say rewarding because I feel like and not to get like too deep, but when I moved here, I feel like I've kind of reflected a lot on myself, and I've actually learned by understanding Portuguese culture and like how people interact and the mindset has helped me understand kind of the environment I was raised in.
Yeah.
So this might sound bad, but Portuguese people are quite anxious. We're quite anxious people, I would say in general, especially Azoreans are known to be anxious. Because imagine if you were living in an island in the middle of nowhere and you think God's causing earthquakes and volcanoes all the time. Well, you'd be anxious too. And I think that something that I learned by being here is kind of understanding that context of anxiety and why, I don't know, maybe Portuguese people are less likely to take risk, for example. like, I think understanding like Portuguese society, a lot of people don't believe in Portugal being like as great as it is. I think a lot of times like people like us like love this country, but a lot of Portuguese people are like, I'm going to leave this country to go emigrate somewhere else. And I think a lot of that is like kind of this anxiety of taking risks. And I think that it's interesting being an American because we're more prone to that. I think taking more risks. So I think it's just interesting. I think, being here, I've learned more about how I've been raised and kind of why I do the things I do or why my family is the way it is, for better or for worse. I'm not saying it in the good or bad, like for good things and bad things, but it's just been very eye-opening for me to actually be immersed in this culture that I think shaped a lot of who I am today.
What are some things that you're doing to be immersed apart from language? Because I think many people at the beginning of their journey, they're not going to have the language skills or even love for languages that you have. So what are some other ways that people can understand the culture a bit better without having a strong grasp on the language?
Yeah, I always think language is important, but like you probably mentioned many times in the show, there's a great level of English here. And I'm saying this because I think the best way to interact with the Portuguese is to talk to them. And a lot of times Portuguese people are very happy to accommodate you. And I think a lot of times people get frustrated when they're trying to speak Portuguese and someone changes on them. It's not because they're trying to correct you. They're trying to accommodate. And they have this mindset of like, who's studying Portuguese? It's not like they're studying Spanish and coming here. Like, it's just not as common. So they're trying to help. But I'm saying this because I find that a lot of people who are expats or move here really isolate themselves, especially in Lisbon, isolate themselves from the Portuguese people. And I really find that it's a disservice because you're not understanding the environment that you're living in. And I feel like sometimes it can almost feel like they're living in an amusement park. Like everything's nice. And they paint this picture of like all these nice amenities that are so much cheaper here than they are in like California. And I'm glad that's the case, but I also think it's important to be cautious of your role in society and also trying to understand the place that's bringing you in. And I remember speaking once with my barber here, we started speaking English because his English was phenomenal, but he'd never been in an English-speaking country, which I don't understand, but that was his life. He watched Boston Legal, so that's how we became friends. But anyways, I was telling him about this and kind of saying, like, I'm aware of like how I'm impacting society. He's like, you're part of the problem, but you're not the problem. And I think that's really has stuck with me because I think if I can contribute in society and just by talking to people or trying to engage with my neighbors and stuff like that, and just being a better citizen, I guess, a more aware citizen, then I think that's a fantastic way of immersing yourself. But obviously there's other things you can do too. I mean, just trying the different foods, learning about the different foods from different regions in Portugal, the music, television, even joining different activities. I know like my freguesia here in Lisbon offers like free yoga on Saturdays. Like there's just certain ways. I think just getting involved with the community in a conscious manner is probably the best way to get immersed, because then you learn so much about people's mindsets and kind of why things work the way they do and stuff like that. And you're not going to get that from a textbook, or you're not going to get that from other expats, even though I do think it's important to have an expat community. For a while, I think during my journey, I was kind of like, I'm really, really immersed, but like you can't deny that part of you that is a foreigner. So I think it's good to have, your
Great
communities advice. And have contact with both. But I think it's good to not forget who you are, but also try to adapt to like the new place that's taking you in.
Nice. Totally agree. What did your barber mean by you're not the problem? You're part of the problem, but you're not the problem.
I think there's this kind of, and I think you guys talked about it a lot on the podcast, but Americans have gotten a lot of like not good press because we're coming here and we're buying all this stuff. And he was saying that's not the problem. The problem is bigger than that. Like, yes, you guys are coming, but you guys are also helping build up our cities and our economy. The problem is the government not having regulation over certain things, not controlling the housing, not controlling immigration as well. So it's like I think he was trying to say it's more of like a institutional problem. And we are part of it. But he said, don't feel guilty. He told me, like, 'cause I was telling him I feel slightly guilty that I'm coming here with a foreign salary. I'm coming here as a privileged American, and I'll say it like that because it's the truth. And I feel like some people here are struggling because of these changes. And he told me, no, you're not part of it. You're helping. Don't think like that. Think of it as like, it's a bigger issue that's bigger than you. So as long as you're conscious of how you are interacting with society and with Portugal, then you should be okay.
So you walked away from that interaction feeling more positive than maybe you first stepped into it. Like he kind of lifted a bit of a burden from you.
Yeah. And we're still friends now. He's not my barber. He moved to a different place far out of Lisbon, but we still talk. Yes, we're still friends. So it worked out. I felt very welcomed by that statement, actually, because I do think I navigate.
I feel encouraged by it, and I wasn't even the one sitting in the chair.
Because I feel like I navigate kind of weird waters because I am Portuguese legally, but am I fully? And I usually say I'm Portuguese American. I'm Luso Americano. That's what I would say because that's what I am. So it's kind of like like I can live here and do whatever, and then also I have so much opportunity. So just keeping that in mind, I guess, while I move here and being conscious of that is just the most important thing. And I've only felt welcomed in Portugal.
Nice. Earlier, you mentioned buying a house. This is a really funny transition considering we're talking about, like Americans using their financial power, snapping things up. But you did mention that you bought a house. You rented when you first moved, but you had purchased something. What was the purchasing process like?
It was insane. Just because of just the factors in it. I will first start by saying, well, obviously having a Spanish salary was helpful, but my parents helped me with a down payment. I'm just saying this because my generation of millennials, like, it's hard to buy a house right now. And I want to be, everyone listening, I want to be fully, like, I had help from my parents and I don't think I could have done it without them. And I'm very grateful for that. But
Thanks,
I basically
Mom and
Dad. And like they come and they actually came to help me find the apartment. So they were and my parents love Portugal and like they're really excited about it. But basically I was just like thinking, okay, I'm going to move to Lisbon. I'm tired of paying rent. I've been paying rent for so long and I just feel like it's money out the window. And then I mentioned that and my parents were like, well, we would like to help you with that. If that's something you want to do, do it. So I reached out to kind of a real estate agency that was kind of designed. They're called Portugal Homes. They're based here in Lisbon, I believe. And I just kind of inquired like, hey, like this is me, blah, blah, blah. And they set us up with like a visit. And it was like July 2021. So Portugal just came out of lockdown and we came here the week after. It was kind of wild. And my parents were like one of the first Americans that could have came here. So they came, we saw 17 apartments. And I did this all, and I feel like Kaylee's going to hate me, but I did this all without a pre-mortgage approval, which was insane, Kyler. I don't know what I was doing, but I was just like, let's go see this house. I found the apartment that's now mine, thankfully. And I was just like, but I don't have approval from the bank. I like got approval from the bank maybe a couple of days before I had to like sign, like do the first deposit.
CPCV.
Not the closing, but the CVC. Yeah, I think then. Yeah. That was wild. And then
stressful, right?
Yes, and I learned my lesson, but the bank, I went with Novo Banco and they're still my bank and they were really good about that. It's actually where I opened my first bank account for the visa. And it happened that my Claudia, who was my lady at the time at the bank, she's not there anymore, but she was very helpful in getting me a mortgage approval. So I did that and it kind of went smooth. It went smoothly in the end. But I also say it's crazy because I took a big risk by buying a property in a place where I didn't really know anyone, but it was the best. I say in retrospect, it's like the best thing I'd done because I could never afford this apartment now. I definitely think like the value of my apartment I would at least have doubled in the past since 2021 for sure.
Okay.
So I know I could never afford where I live now if I didn't do it.
So, I mean, since you're there and you're on the ground, what do you attribute that to? Like that doubling in basically 3.5 years? Like what's happened?
Post-pandemic interest in Portugal, I would say. Just in general, I find it like shocking that people know what Portugal is because I grew up my whole life being like, yeah, Portugal, I have family from there, blah, blah, blah. And no one can tell you where that was. Like Americans did not know where Portugal was. And I definitely think with social media and digital nomads really brought a lot of interest and put Lisbon at least first on the map. But I think, I don't know.
Well,
I always say, I don't know if the Portuguese...
Not to cut you off, but Cristiano Ronaldo's star hadn't risen yet either.
That's true.
Right?
And maybe that was the only thing people knew about Portugal, maybe, was that
when you were growing up.
From here. Yeah. That he was from here. Maybe that was the only thing, but...
Yeah, okay.
But no one outside, which is funny because in my perspective, growing up, I thought everyone was Portuguese at school. It was the first time, I think in high school, it was the first time I had other students that didn't know what Portugal was. It was weird.
Okay.
But anyways, I think that plus, and I always joke about this, but like, I don't know if Portugal did some kind of, and I work in marketing, but they did some great marketing that like, especially in the US, I mean, they had signs up in Times Square, only murders in the building. The latest season talks about Portugal all the time. And I'm like, I grew up my whole life and no one even knew what this was. We thought we were Spain, which people thought Spain was Mexico. So, wasn't doing too well in that. But yeah, I think it's just like good publicity. And I honestly think at the same time, people are finally discovering Portugal. And I think, all these things that we love about it have been here the whole time. I just think people are kind of I don't know, getting the sand off, I don't know, just like dusting it off and discovering it for the first time. So I think, yeah, it's a combination of that.
Yeah, I think for me, things, at least, watching what's happened in Portugal over the past, not just the 4 years that Kaylee and I have been here, but even before that, when we also lived in Spain. We lived in Spain starting in 2009 and took our first trip here in 2009. We saw what Portugal was like then. And at that point, I mean, we're talking about over 15 years ago, visiting Porto and seeing half of the buildings empty in the historic city center, and seeing how gritty the area that every tourist wants to visit now was back then and what it is now. To us, it was a hidden gem. And there was something about telling this story and shining a light on this hidden gem to let it shine itself. I think what's happened in traditional media is something's happened in reverse, whereby so many people have been talking about Portugal, either blogs, social media posts, word of mouth, that finally it came to where it's like maybe someone on the board of tourism or whatever is like, yeah, maybe we should actually talk about ourselves a little bit and puff out our chest, because they seemed a bit late to the game in terms of this publicity.
Yes. And I think that describes Portuguese mindset again. I think they're very humble people. So they're not going to be ones bragging about Portugal. They're going to love Portugal. And when you start talking about it, they're going to you have the bandera, you have the flag out and do all this stuff. Yeah. Very proud. More so than in Spain, for sure. Spanish people aren't always proud to be Spanish for different reasons. But I think that, that mindset, I don't think they think they're a great place all the time to come to. And I think we have to keep in context, it was 74, the dictatorship fell, 74, pretty 74, sure. Yeah. We had a financial crisis 2008, which was really bad in Portugal. I mean, the IMF had to come in and intervene for a long time. And I think we're kind of in the post-boom of that. So I think also maybe other countries were taking strides in advertising. In 2008, things were tough here, and a lot of Portuguese people left. So I think finding abandoned buildings was normal because Portugal had the highest, and it maybe still has the highest emigration rate in the EU. So most people leave, and you can find Portuguese people everywhere. And you think I'm saying that as a joke? I'm not. It's the truth. No. You can find Portuguese people everywhere because they've gone everywhere. So I think now the spotlight's changed. It's focusing more on Portugal. But I think the mindset was always outside of Portugal and leaving. And that's why my family left. If you think about it, there was no opportunities here. But now I think there are. And I think it's great.
Well, I get a sense that the spotlight being on Portugal excites you. What excites you about that?
Yeah, you sensed it, and it's hard to describe, but I'm just very proud to be Portuguese American. I'm very proud of this country. I love it. I don't know. There's and I think maybe people probably listening are asking why Spain versus Portugal and stuff like that. And I love Spain. I love Spain. Trust me, it's one of my favorite places ever. I go back all the time. I speak the language and all this stuff, so it's very much part of who I am. But I never felt Spanish. I never felt 100% integrated, and I lived there for 8 years, I think. I always felt like the foreigner. And I feel when I'm here, obviously I have my own spin on it because I'm not Portuguese, but when I'm here, I feel very much accepted for that and just very proud. I think that's something that's been taught to me from my parents and from my grandparents, kind of my family struggled to get to where they are now. And I think it's kind of a cool full circle moment to be I'm here and kind of taking back the narrative in a way. And it feels really special. So yeah, I don't know. I just love everything about Portugal just because I think it's been so ingrained in me and it's kind of this nice, I've been out of the US for a while and I kind of see it as this hybrid, it's kind of the combination of both worlds. I lived in Spain where I didn't know anything and I didn't identify with that while I lived in the US, but then I kind of have this middle ground of Portugal, which combines kind of everything in one place.
What were some of the things that happened or the sentiment in Spain that made you not feel totally integrated?
There's many ways I felt integrated, but I always felt I think Spanish people are very direct, and I'm saying this with all love in the world, but they're very direct. So I to this day, even though I'm fluent in Spanish and I wrote a master's thesis in a program where I was the only non-Spanish person in Spanish linguistics, and I still have a conversation with someone and they'll stop me and say, yeah, but you speak great Spanish, but you have a strong accent. I'm that's not anything I can change, right? Wow. So that kind of things put me off. And I think Spanish people I find a difference with Portugal. This sounds awful, but here, I'm going to say it. But Spanish and Portuguese colonization, you can see a lot in Portuguese culture and food, although both of them are very bad. I'm not supporting colonization or slavery or anything like that. But look at Portuguese food. There's so much influence from the outside, from the places that Portuguese people went to. While in Spain, it's not like that. And I think Spanish people are very closed-minded in that sense towards a foreigner, I would say. They can be. While I feel like it's very, and I don't think that's on purpose, but I think in Portugal, for example, you talk to any Portuguese person, they're going to have someone that lives abroad or they've lived abroad. So a lot of Portuguese people have experience living far from home. And I think when they meet someone that has come far from their home, they're really nice to them about that. While I feel like
there's
in Spain,
more empathy.
Yes. While in Spain, it's historically very different just because of the context, I think, just because of colonies falling way before before the 20th century, and then being dictatorship, being very isolated from the world. And while Portugal we still had colonies until 74 as well. So
this is what surprised me when you said that you felt like Spanish people are, let's say, less nationalistic. And I use that term being kind of neutral, this idea of like national identity more than any sort of political way. But it sounded like you're saying that Portuguese people are prouder to be Portuguese than Spanish people are proud of being Spanish. When Kaylee and I lived in Spain, we got the opposite impression. We look at Portuguese as being quietly proud, nationalistic, whereas like Spanish were more like chest thumping, proud to be Spanish. And I think it does manifest itself in like those micro comments where someone's like, yeah, you say all the things correctly in Spanish, but your accent. Whereas in Portugal, like anytime you make an effort to speak Portuguese, they're like, your Portuguese is great. And it's like, I know my Portuguese is bad, but like they're just happy that you're participating in that way. And Spanish people, not so much.
And did you and Kaylee only live in Madrid?
You only lived in Madrid. Yeah.
And that's probably why. And I only say that because in Madrid, the comparison I can say is that if you hang a Spanish flag outside your balcony in Spain, you're a fascist. Like people will call you fascist because, and I think it's a big part of it. Madrid's the capital, but in Spain,
let's explain that to the audience.
Yes,
because I know exactly what you're saying. Yes, because I've studied Spanish history. So yes, go.
Spanish history is very complex, and the thing I love about Spain the most is how diverse it is. So there's 4 national languages. People don't realize that. There's Spanish, Gallego, which is like a relative of Portuguese,
north of us,
and Catalan. Also, some smaller languages too that aren't nationally recognized, but that also means different cultures and identities. So I think a lot of people don't understand Barcelona and the Catalonia question, but like you need to look at that population. They have a totally different history, totally different language. They were oppressed. And this is the part where I think a lot of the fascist comments are going to come from, because in 36, the Spanish Civil War happens. And so 39, Franco becomes the dictator and makes everything Spain, 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 and creates this false sense of nationalism. So we know flamenco and we know like ole, ole and bullfights because Franco really put that in his agenda and pushed that to the world in like the 60s to open Spain to tourism. While a person from Catalonia, they don't like flamenco. That's not them. Or someone from, the Basque country is totally different. So Spain has a lot of cultural tensions, I think, because it is a country that's set up historically in a way that the kingdoms kind of came together and they kind of were able to keep that autonomy over those regions. And I think it causes things. And in Spain, being this capital, is kind of seen as like the center of Spain. So that's why I was asking if you lived mostly in Madrid, because a lot of people in Madrid will have a Spanish flag and will be very proud to be Spain, but that sometimes gets a very negative connotation by a lot of Spanish people. So
you hit the nail on the head. and Kaylee and I, up until about 2 years ago, we actually didn't recognize that a lot of our thoughts and feelings about Spain and about Spaniards and about Spanish were actually more directed at Madrileños and Madrid and that lived experience there. Because as we reflected deeper on our travels through Spain and going to really all the regions, we've been to all of the continental regions, that our journeys there, we had different interactions with the Spanish, nicer interactions, like more pleasant, friendly interactions versus the way we felt actually in Spain itself.
Yeah.
Okay.
It really makes a difference, the big city versus the smaller places.
Massive. And for us, we've now realized in our minds and hearts, we're second city people, not capital city people. Drawing comparison then back to Portugal with this regional tension that occurs in Spain, do you find that here in Portugal, are there any tensions between the islands looking badly at continental? Like, how do you feel about that?
Yes.
The use of resources?
It depends. Okay, I think in general, it's more playful fun, I would say. Like, obviously, there's a rivalry between Porto and Lisbon.
Super Balkan Sagres.
Exactly. We have some playful things there. The Alentejo, people speak like a very sing-song way, and they're kind of like, that's the vibe they get. Stuff like that. I will say with the islands, there's some things, and it kind of annoys me, but I would say, like, at least growing up in the US, there was a lot of tension between the continent versus the islands, and also Azores versus Madeira amongst us. But a lot of it was the continental people thought that we were just poor farmers, basically. Azorians are poor farmers, not educated, but they speak an awful Portuguese, which I will say, their Portuguese spoken, at least in São Miguel, it's a whole other ball game. They need to put subtitles on for Portuguese people here in the continental Portugal, because they don't understand. But I think that I had that awareness coming here. And then when I tell people I'm from the Azores, I get mixed reception. I think there's two areas. One is, and I think a lot of it is just ignorance, and I'll say that out loud, but basically people that never been there before will make the weird comments. They don't understand the people or something like that. Like, I remember telling someone that they stopped me and they were like, "Oh wow, your Portuguese is really great." And I was like, "Well, thank you. I learned." And I told them, like, my grandparents from the Azores told the whole story. And they're like, "Yeah, they didn't teach you because that's not real Portuguese. I've been told that." And that's been stuff like that. But anyways, the more positive answer is people that know the Azores, either have traveled there, have lived there for a time, they love it. And I think there's a lot of appreciation for that. So there is that tension, I would say, sometimes. I do think the stigma exists. The island people, and I know people that are from the islands that will come here and are almost embarrassed to speak Portuguese because they'll get made fun of for their accent. But it's not as intense as Spain, but I definitely seen some things there. Yes.
Yeah. Kind of, this has been fascinating, like talking about sociocultural things and going through your personal story, as you have shared so much knowledge. You've really enriched this community here. I need to ask you the question, because you've been living abroad for over a decade. At Expats Everywhere, we believe that living abroad transforms lives. I'm curious to know, how has living abroad transformed your life?
And you want to wrap up the podcast? I feel like we're going to open up a whole can of worms. But gosh, I think it's the best thing I've ever done in my entire life. And I will for so many reasons, but I think the ones that come to mind right away is I learned a lot about myself. I did this on my own, and I learned so much confidence by doing that. It's hard. I will tell anyone listening to this, it's not a walk in the park. And you're going to, move to a place, and you're going to maybe have a honeymoon period. And then you're going to I hate everything about this and I miss home. That happens, and that's normal. But I took those opportunities as a way to learn more about me and kind of how I can put myself out in new situations, even be on this podcast. I wrote to you saying, I want to do this. I gained a lot of confidence, I think, by living abroad. I don't have shame about that. But I also think I've learned my perspective has changed a lot on just the world. I could have easily stayed in my small little town in Massachusetts or, and had that mindset. But I think by living abroad and the people I've met during that, even if it's just like a passing interaction, I definitely have some of those that I hold on tightly to, because I've learned so much about other perspectives and other ways to look at life and other ways to experience the world. And I think that also, like, learning languages has been a great part of that as well, because by learning a language, you also learn other perspectives. So yeah, I don't know. I think it's I definitely recommend it to everyone. Even if you don't like it in the end and go back home, that's totally fine. But I definitely think it's for me, I don't plan on going back anytime soon, just because it's been so long and I'm so happy here. And I'm fortunate enough to go to the US to visit, and Boston is very easy to get to from here. It's 6-hour flight. So it's really convenient to go home if I need to. But yeah, I don't know. It's definitely made my life what it is. And I think my life's great. I'm very happy with my life. So, and I definitely attribute that to moving abroad.
That's amazing to hear. This has been a fascinating conversation for me to have. I hope the listeners enjoyed it. And I might I say, this has been wicked awesome. I know I didn't use the correct accent, but
wicked
for
awesome.
Real, wicked awesome. There we go. I loved it. This was amazing. Thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it. Thank you.
No, thank you. I really appreciate it.